The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. As we edge forward to a goal of net zero in Canada and the United States, the reality of that aspiration runs headlong into the ongoing and increasing need for energy. Net zero means completely negating the amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced by human activity. The theory is that a combination of emissions reductions and the implementation of carbon sequestering can and will balance the volume of carbon in the atmosphere with the volume that we remove. There are countless initiatives underway. For example, a Canadian company called Savante, based in British Columbia, has been enjoying impressive results. So too is Bill Gates' carbon capture company, Graphite. Interestingly, though, that Graphite's company website acknowledges that 5 to 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide need to be removed from the atmosphere annually by 2050. Today, the world removes less than 0.001% of that. The quest is underway, but at what cost? In British Columbia, the government acknowledges its commitment to net zero will have a significant impact on the economy. That impact, in turn, will increase the cost of living and lower per capita GDP. Roger Pielke Jr., the author of The Iron Law, states that when the cost of carbon mitigation impacts the cost of living, voters turn away from protecting the environment, and so do politicians. I invited Roger Pielke Jr. to join me for a conversation that matters about our energy needs and our ability to reach our environmental goals. Roger, welcome.
Stuart, it's great to be here.
The aspiration of net zero. From your perspective, are we setting an unrealistic target? And in doing so, what are the risks that are inherent with not having realistic projections?
Yeah, so the target of net zero comes with a timetable also. And the timetable needs to match the realities and practicalities of the global energy system. The fact of the matter is that humans are impacting the energy balance of the Earth system. We are causing the climate to change. So, from that basis alone, reducing or even eliminating that impact is smart policy. The question is at what cost and on what timescale. Just recently, Václav Smil, a great energy expert from Canada, has argued that 2050 is not in the cards. It's just not going to happen. It's too difficult, too impractical, too costly. But that doesn't mean that we can't make progress towards hitting a net zero target later in the century. And we can talk about this also. That seems much more practical and realistic and affordable.
Okay, so if we don't start to hit that target or the cost is too high, what then happens to public support for the goals that collectively, I think virtually all of us have said, yeah, that's where we want to get to? Will we lose our enthusiasm and stop embracing the concept?
Yeah, you've put your finger on one of the greatest risks of climate policy is that poor policy design, poor policy implementation will turn people off to the entire project. The examples that I use as analogies that I think help us think more about energy transitions are feeding the world. So it's been a better part of a century for agricultural improvements as global populations have increased. In the 1970s, there was fear that we were going to not be able to produce enough food for people around the world, to be mass starvation. And it turns out through incremental progress in agricultural technology, but implemented on farms around the world, we've gotten better and better. And if you ask people in the 1970s, what are the agricultural breakthroughs of the early 21st century, they wouldn't know. But it was our commitment to sustained incremental progress. The other example I use is public health. Human lifespans on planet Earth have doubled over the last century. And that's through, again, a combination of improvements in public health, improvements in medicine, and incremental progress. It doesn't all happen in one fell swoop. And there's a lot of progress left to go because there's a lot of places around the world where lifespans aren't as high as they could be. So if we think about energy transitions as long-term, incremental, sustained progress, I think we are much better situated to maintain public support for that project, rather than saying, we have to turn on a dime, which is not going to it's not going to transform the energy system, and it might lead to a loss of political support.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. I was somewhat taken aback at a statistic that I had read, that when the number one source of transportation in the United States finally became the automobile, it was 50 years since it was first introduced as a replacement to the horse. It took 50 years. And what they didn't have then was a remarkable infrastructure that was supporting one technology that you were then trying to replace. But there was no timeline that said that it had to happen. It's, as you pointed out, it was incremental change. So coming back to my earlier question, what happens to our commitment to climate or the environment if we start to realize, this transition isn't going to take place on time, and now we're starting to run short of the legacy energy sources that we had before?
Yeah, a big problem in climate policy is there's too much attention paid to the end date. How do we get those last few tons of carbon dioxide out of the system in 2050 or 2070 or whenever that happens to be? We need much more sustained attention to how do we improve the rate of decarbonization that really has been going on for a long time. We have much more economic activity per unit of carbon dioxide that we produce, and that we should accelerate. You notice that we will focus on things like the price of gasoline. We focus on Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that means for natural gas. So the short-term pressures on the global economy and energy system are the ones that we are always going to respond to. And so climate policy needs to be designed with an aspirational long-term target. That's fine. But actually, what are we going to do this year? What are we going to do next year? If we want to have a target and a timetable, well, then let's have a 2025 target and timetable and talk about our short-term progress. Because long-term progress is just the accumulation of all our short-term goals. And we don't talk about that enough in climate policy.
Does Germany stand as an example of possibly being overambitious, turning off coal-generated power stations only to realize we have to turn them back on? And is that kind of reversal the sort of thing that starts to quell enthusiasm for where it is that we want to go?
Yeah, across Europe, there's a lot of important lessons to be drawn. Just in recent days and weeks, you have farmers in Germany and in Brussels protesting because of the high cost of fertilizer, which again is an offshoot from fossil fuels. Germany's a really interesting case because Germany decided they wanted to eliminate nuclear power, and for a lot of historical reasons, nuclear power is not popular in Germany. But at the same time have very ambitious emissions reductions targets. It's a simple mathematical exercise. If Germany had not turned off its nuclear power plants, it could be coal-free today. And so by eliminating one of the largest possible sources of carbon-free electricity, Germany has shown us that, well, in many cases, the alternative is fossil fuels. So energy is interesting because people associate energy technologies with their favorite soccer club or football team, and they cheer for it. Go wind, go solar, go nuclear, go fossil fuels. And the reality is that the global energy system is going to need a healthy mix of supply for decades. And if we want to wean ourselves off, let's say we want to wean ourselves off coal to start with, the dirtiest polluting, it must be replaced with something. In some places, solar and wind with storage and backup is certainly possible. But in many places, nuclear power is probably the best available source. This is what we're learning in Japan right now as they slowly bring their nuclear fleet back online, because Japan does not have substantial wind and solar resources.
So actually, you bring up a very interesting point about nuclear. When we take a look at fourth and fifth generation power plants, which are small, they're modular, and in most cases, they're using some sort of spent uranium fuel. Is this really a practical energy alternative, especially if we say you can't rely on wind, you can't rely on run of river, you can't rely on solar. How important does the nuclear component in this equation start to become?
Yeah, well, I've been studying climate policy for a long time, and I cannot make the math of decarbonization work out without nuclear playing a substantial role. I know there are arguments made that, well, maybe we can do it without nuclear. The reality is that nuclear energy makes that challenge much more tractable. We can, one positive that nuclear has going for it is that we can replace fossil fuel power plants with nuclear power plants, and we already have the grid connections, the transmission lines already in place. One of the problems in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act is that it has a lot of subsidies for deploying wind and solar, but how are you going to get that electricity to large population centers? You need transmission. And it turns out people don't want transmission lines going through their community, through their local state parks, and so on. So nuclear it's not quite a plug and play sort of thing, but it is possible, and there are plans. The U.S. Department of Energy has written up plans for transitioning coal plants or retired coal plants into nuclear power plants. Looking around the world, there's a lot of places that are building nuclear power plants right now. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that nuclear is going to have a continuing role. And as you allude to, we're early in the technological innovation curve for nuclear energy. There's a lot still to be done. Nuclear had its heyday in the 60s, 70s, early 80s, but then we kind of stopped and stopped the innovation process. So I'm optimistic that in the 21st century, we're going to see a lot of new advances, and whether it's smaller modular nuclear reactors like we see on military submarines that power small communities, or more of the legacy reactors, like the CANDU reactors that have really been successful. I think nuclear is going to have a great future.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. What about some of the alternatives? We talked a little bit about solar and wind, but there has been the promise of fusion. And I know it seems like it's an elusive promise, but I know that there are 5 major efforts going on around the world. Could fusion be an opportunity for us to really reduce, especially the output from coal?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the old joke. I think I first heard this when I was in grad school, that fusion was the energy source of the future, and it always will be.
Yeah.
I've expressed a view of technological agnosticism. So I really do think that it's important to explore all sorts of possibilities. And when we have our government and international research development budgets, fusion should certainly be in there. And the true test of a technology is, does it work out in the real world? And so whether it's carbon capture, whether it's fusion, advanced nuclear, I'm all for it, but we have to prove it first. And so there's a lot of arguments online, and a lot of nerdy professors like me make arguments about their favorite technology. But my view is, well, let's put some money into it and see how far we can go. Fusion hasn't produced much energy to date of scale, so I temper any optimism on that, but put it in the portfolio for sure.
The other side of the equation, of course, is we're talking about sequestering. And I made note to the fact that Bill Gates has invested fairly heavily in this. And then there's this company here in Canada called Svante. Interestingly enough, named after Svante Arrhenius.
Yeah.
I thought that's a very clever naming. Of course, just for anybody who's not sure, Svante Arrhenius was the fellow who went to Hawaii, measured carbon concentrations at 280 parts per million back in the 1880s. And so I think it's a nice tip of the hat to him. But when you look at the science of carbon capturing and noting that we're at 0.001% of what we need to capture, is that a practical alternative if we're saying we're driving towards net zero at 2050?
Yeah, and again, this is a great example of where we need to have tempered expectations and expect incrementalism. So if there's a lot of smart people around the world working on carbon capture technologies, and I'm all for that sort of innovation. But again, the true test is out in the field. And, does it work and at an acceptable cost? Canada is one place where probably the greatest concentration of effort is going into carbon capture. There's some places in the Middle East, Iceland, and elsewhere. I mean, one of the challenges is that carbon capture takes a lot of energy. And so, that takes us right back to nuclear power. We might need nuclear power to capture carbon. So yeah, put it in put that in the portfolio. It hasn't, as you said very eloquently in the introduction, it hasn't done much yet. But this is, if we think before the green revolution in agriculture, we had no idea what sort of improvements in productivity lay ahead. So again, let's play it out and see if we can do better this year, next year, the year after, and if we're making progress, that gives us some reason for optimism with that technology.
So you talk quite a bit in over the years about how scientific discussions are affecting political policy. We haven't got it exactly right, have we?
Well, one of the challenges in climate policy is a lot of our discussions and thinking about policy are mediated through sophisticated, complex modeling exercises. And for just here's an example. Less than a decade ago, most of the leading modelers who were looking at climate policy built in carbon capture and storage at a huge scale, and that balanced the books in the end. They were putting into their models technologies that didn't exist in the real world. And so it does shape how we think about policy options, costs, and benefits. And of course, we need modeling to some degree, but we need to balance that out with real world implementation and see what works. There's for a long time a global harmonized carbon tax was put into these models. That's probably not in the cards in the near term. So I would like to see a much broader exploration of policy options than just those that are fed into a small suite of models. Another example is there's a recent paper by some colleagues in India who have looked at equity issues related to climate. There's vast parts of the world that don't enjoy the access to energy that you and I do on a unthinkingly on a daily basis. And a lot of these models that build in climate policy success leave vast parts of the world poor and in the dark. That's not going to be acceptable. So we do need a way to broaden the sorts of expertise, diversify the voices that are developing policy options. And I think that makes climate policy that much richer.
The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you. You bring up a very interesting point about, of course, the equity. We take a look here, and you may know to the fact that in Canada we're making some pretty good gains, and there's a tremendous amount of energy that's going into innovation. We can afford to do that right now. Whereas you take a look at a country like India that relies so heavily on coal generated electricity, if you suddenly now tell them that they have to make that change at this stage in their economic reshaping, it's going to have a very negative impact on their economy. And I cannot foresee Prime Minister Modi going, okay, I'm going to embrace that. And so if that's not going to happen, and if there isn't a collective will beyond the shores of North America and Northern Europe, how are we going to achieve our goals?
Yeah, this is a great question, and India has told the world that development in energy access is their number one priority above climate goals. They have set long-term 2070 sort of targets for decarbonizing their economy, but in the short term, you're exactly right. They are just in the past few days, India, the government has announced they're going to possibly have a border adjustment for imported coal because they want to increase domestic supply. And there's other dimensions to energy besides climate. There's security. All countries want to be sure that they can keep the lights on for their population. And relying on fuel sources from faraway places gets to be a little tricky. So this is where innovation again offers a way to kind of thread this needle. That if there are energy technologies that are affordable, they're secure, they can be domestically supported, then you'll find countries will rapidly implement them. So this is, again, this nuclear is not a silver bullet, but if there are modular nuclear reactors that are scalable, there's a lot of places in India, eventually on the continent of Africa, where people will readily go towards these technologies. I mean, if you look right now, I mean, the fuel of choice in many places around the world is natural gas, and liquefied natural gas in particular. And that's because there is a diversity of supply. You can get it from Canada or the United States or Qatar. It's movable, and it is a lot cleaner than coal. And so you can show some progress, at least in the short term, towards emissions reduction goals. So countries are going to continue to develop. If there's one thing that I think you can take to the bank, it's going to be increasing energy consumption worldwide for the foreseeable future.
Well, I note in one of your columns, you point out that in the last 30 years, especially since Kyoto, energy production has gone up by more than 55% of what it was in the 1990s, and it's going to continue to rise, especially if you take a look at projections. So, liquefied natural gas is an interesting alternative. Just to wrap up, I want to go back to you mentioned Vaclav Semel earlier, and he has pointed out that if we don't have realistic expectations, then we've got challenges. How important is it that we pay attention to his message along with yours?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a student of Vaclav's, as in most everybody who does energy policy, and he hits a very important point that the realities of policy implementation can be frustrating, they can be uncomfortable, and they may not align with people's desire for rapid changes. But at the same time, our policy making will be much more effective when it is grounded in the real world constraints and realities that we face in energy policy in particular, because we have to respect not only physics, but also politics. And both of those are pretty hard boundaries for putting together a global energy transformation.
Well, I think we also have to pay attention to the developmental process in securing supply sources of critical minerals. If we can't do that, then we can't meet the needs of the replacement technology. And that's a long-term process as well. And so that's why I think realistic timelines need to be applied to where we're wanting to go as far as protecting the environment, so that we remain committed to that.
Yeah, and one of the lessons we need to just keep in the forefront is that we know how to do technological innovation. As a species, we are very good at it. We don't always apply the lessons of what we've learned across the board. Energy policy has always been a little bit strange. Americans of my generation will know of Jed Clampett from the Beverly Hillbillies, where oil just came out of the ground and he became rich. And there has been this view that, well, the energy economy can be left to private sector companies or state agencies in the Middle East. And we're realizing that, well, to hit directed policy goals, we need to be thinking more of a mixed sort of economy with public and private cooperation to accelerate the rates of decarbonization that we've seen.
Well, I think in the words of Teddy Roosevelt, he says, when theories hit the harsh reality of life, that's when you start to make decisions and move in a direction that truly is attainable. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.